In the early 1990s, one company broke Nintendo's rules, and for a moment, it looked like the entire gaming industry was about to flip sides. They called it a war. But what actually happened was closer to a jailbreak. For nearly a decade, Nintendo didn't just sell consoles. It ran a system, a carefully controlled ecosystem of cartridges, contracts, and permissions that decided who could make games, how many could be released, and when they were allowed to appear on store shelves. Developers didn't just work with Nintendo, they worked inside Nintendo's world. Then Sega showed up and refused to play by those rules. This is not the story of a mascot or a slogan or a console. This is the story of a challenger that realized the real battle wasn't about hardware. It was about who controlled the culture. Sega entered the American market as an outsider. In Japan, it had been around for decades, building arcade machines and niche hardware. But in the late 1980s, in the shadow of Nintendo's dominance, Sega of America looked at the industry and saw something different. They didn't see a system, they saw a mood. Nintendo's world felt safe, bright, child-friendly, trusted by parents and retailers who still remembered the crash of 1983. The NES had rebuilt confidence in video games by promising order and reliability. That promise came with rules, and those rules shaped everything from pricing to release schedules. Sega's leadership in the US believed that very safety was becoming a weakness. They believed there was an audience growing up faster than Nintendo was willing to follow. So Sega made a decision that looked reckless at the time. They didn't try to out-Nintendo, they tried to outgrow it. The Genesis wasn't marketed as a toy, it was marketed as an attitude. Black casing, sharp edges, fast processors, loud colors, aggressive ads. Sega didn't talk about family fun, they talked about speed, power, and being different. And then came the line that defined the era. Genesis does what Nintendo don't. It wasn't just a slogan, it was a declaration of independence. Behind the scenes, Sega was fighting a much quieter battle. Nintendo's licensing system meant developers often had to choose sides. Exclusive contracts, cartridge manufacturing controls, and strict limits on how many titles a publisher could release each year created an environment where leaving Nintendo's ecosystem carried real financial risk. Sega's strategy was to make that risk feel worth it. They offered better terms, faster approvals, more freedom in content, and most importantly, a platform that promised access to a different kind of audience, older, bolder, and hungry, for something that didn't feel like it came from a toy store. For a moment, it worked. Third-party developers began to hedge their bets. Some started releasing parallel versions of games. Others leaned into Sega's edgier brand. Sports titles, fighting games, and arcade-style experiences found a home on the Genesis that felt natural, even inevitable. The industry began to split, not just by console, by identity. This is where Sega almost changed everything. Because if Nintendo controlled the rules, Sega was trying to control the narrative. The console war became a culture war. Nintendo stood for tradition, trust, and family. Sega stood for rebellion, speed, and youth. It showed up in magazines, in commercials, in schoolyards, in the way kids talked about their consoles like they were sports teams. Gaming stopped being something you owned. It became something you belonged to. And then Sega went bigger. They looked at Nintendo's dominance in hardware cycles and realized something dangerous. Nintendo moved carefully, methodically, slowly. So Sega decided to move fast. The Sega CD, the 32X, add-ons designed to extend the life of the Genesis and keep the market in motion before Nintendo could reset the board with a new console. On paper, it looked like innovation. In reality, it was fragmentation. Developers were confused, consumers were confused, retailers didn't know which version of the future they were supposed to stock. Sega was breaking rules, but it was also breaking its own platform. Inside Sega, the company itself began to split. Sega of America and Sega of Japan didn't just disagree on strategy, they competed. Hardware decisions, launch timing, and product direction were often made in parallel, not in alignment. The rebel was starting to fight itself, and that's the hidden cost of trying to outrun a system instead of replacing it. For a brief window in the early 1990s, Sega stood at the edge of something extraordinary. Nintendo was no longer untouchable. Developers had options, players had identities, retailers had leverage. The rules of play were bending, but Sega never wrote new ones. Instead of building a new system to replace Nintendo's, Sega kept pushing against the old. 1. Faster launches, louder marketing, more hardware, more risk. The industry didn't need more motion, it needed a new foundation, and that's when the outsider arrived. While Nintendo and Sega fought over who controlled the present, a third company watched, carefully from the sidelines. Sony didn't enter gaming through toys or arcades. It entered through media, music, movies, discs, developers. Sony understood something both giants were missing. The next phase of gaming wouldn't be about cartridges, mascots, or even consoles. It would be about platforms. Sega had opened the door by proving Nintendo's system could be challenged, but Sony walked through it with a completely different strategy, one built around developers first, hardware second, and global reach from day one. The war Sega started changed the battlefield, it just didn't get to win on it. In hindsight, Sega's rebellion looks like a paradox. They were right about almost everything. They were right that gaming was growing up. They were right that identity mattered. They were right that control could be challenged. But they were wrong about where power would settle. Sega tried to win the industry by being louder, faster, and bolder. Nintendo tried to win it by holding the rules. Sony would win it by building the marketplace. By the late 1990s, the rebel was exhausted. The Dreamcast would arrive as one of the most innovative consoles ever made, online. Features, arcade-perfect graphics, forward-looking design, and it still wouldn't be enough. Because by then, the center of gravity had shifted. Gaming wasn't just about playing anymore, it was about who owned the relationship between players and creators. Sega's real legacy isn't a console, it's a crack in the system. They proved that Nintendo's world wasn't inevitable, that control could be challenged, that culture could move faster than contracts. Every platform that came after, from PlayStation to Xbox to digital storefronts, exists in the space Sega forced open. They didn't take the industry back, but they made it possible for someone else to. Sega broke the rules, but the next company rewrote the entire game. Watch the episode where the outsider turned gaming into a global platform.